To this just in, a fast hour around the world of sports. I am Dan Graziano in for Max Kellerman. This is Tim Bontemps. That is Brian Windhorst. And we are starting today with the NBA and an end of an era in Brooklyn. Let's wind the clock back to take you back in time 3 years ago, nearly to the day. The Nets sent shockwaves through the league by signing Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving in free agency. However, the Kyrie and KD era in Brooklyn did not go exactly as fans had hoped. The duo appeared in only 58 of a possible 247 regular season and playoff games. And now, just days after Kyrie opted into his player option with the Nets for next season, Durant requested a trade from Brooklyn, naming Phoenix and Miami among his preferred destinations. So that all happened at the end of our show yesterday. So we got everybody back together today to talk about it, because we really didn't have enough time at the end of the show yesterday. I had about 10 minutes, right? So let's reintroduce Brian Windhorst and Tim Bontemps, our NBA reporters. Windy, a KD trade would be obviously transformational for whichever team lands him. So what's the latest you're hearing on the status?
Yeah, so he definitely would like to go play in Phoenix. You know, he formed a relationship last year with Devin Booker when they were on the U.S. Olympic team. They really both played big roles on that team. They both helped carry the team to the Olympic medal. And he has expressed an interest not only to play with him, but also to play with Chris Paul. And you can imagine that triumvirate. You don't even really, obviously you have to fill in the team around him, but it doesn't even matter who you put there. That would be a very powerful triumvirate. But I will say this, from what I understand, I don't know if the Nets instantaneously are in love with the package that the Suns can offer, even though they can offer up to 4 first-round draft picks. So the executives that I talked to believe that today and over the weekend, we could see the Suns or the Nets look to expand that trade, potentially to involve a third team. Because if you can't provide what the team, what the star wants, you have to go out and look for that. And that can take some time. But definitely the Nets are talking to other teams. There's a number of teams that have made interesting offers. And from what I am told, the Nets are telling teams that they want a young star player, which does in every team. And they're looking for at least 3 first-round draft picks. Now, these first-round draft picks and these first-round draft picks may not all be equal. You know, they have different values depending on what the protections are. But that seems to me to be a baseline where you would start is a star player and a whole bevy of picks. So
when you're talking about that, Tim, what are some other teams that have a realistic shot here if they need to do that?
Well, Brian, as we've talked about a bunch, Phoenix and Miami are 2 teams we know Kevin Durant wants to go to. And then you get to other options where maybe it's not necessarily an automatic that Kevin Durant want to go there, but that they have a lot of stuff to trade. One of those places would be the New Orleans Pelicans, who have a ton of draft picks. They've got Brandon Ingram. They've got Zion Williamson, who until he signs an extension could in theory be used as a pretty large trade chip, and you can use that in a bunch of different ways. And the other team I think to talk to in that regard is the Toronto Raptors. They've got Scotty Barnes, this year's Rookie of the Year, a 6'10 freak of an athlete who really blossomed into a big-time player this year. They've got Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, Fred VanVleet. They got a ton of good players on good contracts that they can move. So those are a couple more off-the-radar things. But to Brian's point about the Suns, the interesting thing about Phoenix, even if they don't necessarily have exactly what the Brooklyn Nets want right now, because they have access to all 7 of their picks going forward. They can trade 4, they can give the swap rights to 3 more. And they also have young guys like DeAndre Ayton, who they can move in a sign and trade, and then Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson. They have the ability to not only send maybe all of that to Brooklyn, but use some of it, to Brian's point, to go get something else that maybe the Nets would prefer to have in a deal instead. So I do think that Phoenix is well positioned to make this happen one way or the other if they're willing to go all the way in. But it might take, to Brian's point, some creativity and more teams getting involved, which could make this drag out for a little bit.
One thing I'll point out about New Orleans, which is a very fascinating option, not only for Zion Williamson, but also for whatever else they have. Willie Green, their head coach, was an assistant when Kevin Durant was in Golden State. He's very well liked by his players. And it might, not that the Nets don't need Durant's permission to trade him somewhere with 4 years left on his contract, but if a team wanted to get momentum towards a deal, getting Durant's blessing could be very valuable. So I believe the Pelicans are hoping that relationship with Willie Green could somehow play into their favor. Now, what you would have to do is you would have to ask the Nets permission to let them talk. But if the Nets liked what potentially the Pelicans could offer, that's something that could happen. And during last season, C.J. McCollum got traded from Portland to New Orleans. And when he first got heard about the trade, I think he was kind of like, boy, I played in Portland my whole career. I'm not crazy. And the Pelicans sold him on how great it would be there. And by the way, they do have a very promising future. And CJ completely turned it around. By the time he got there and started playing, he was totally bought in. So it would be interesting if the Nets like what the Pelicans have enough to grant such a permission, and if Willie Green, who is known to really be able to lead and inspire players, could talk Durant into expanding that list a little bit. These are some of the things that teams are going to be trying to pull off in the coming days.
Right. I mean, you say that they don't need Durant's permission to send him to a team, but we're in a situation where he doesn't want to play for Brooklyn, so he's not going to be playing for Brooklyn. So obviously his opinion matters a lot here. I mean, what happens? He's got 4 years left on his deal. What happens if they can't find what they want in return, or they can't find a team that he would be willing to show up and play for?
I mean, obviously in that scenario, who knows what would happen. I do think ultimately, though, there is going to be some sort of a resolution here, in large part because you have the entire team, or the entire league, invested in finding a way to get this done.
Right.
Because you have all sorts of teams that are coming in with trades, and the teams that are involved and are interested, that do want to get it done, they're going to find a way to get it done. Because when players like Kevin Durant come along, it's basically once in a generation, you find a way to make this kind of trade happen. So there are certainly, I'm sure you could come up with a scenario where there's not a Kevin Durant trade that happens. But I think it's safe to say that sometime here in the next, I don't even want to put a time frame on it to hopefully have us have some sort of a holiday weekend. But I do think that, at some point we're going to get this thing done because it's in everyone's interest involved to get a resolution here.
So where does he end up?
My pick from the beginning has been Phoenix. I think when you look at the nexus of what Kevin Durant wants, if you look at Phoenix and Miami, to me, Phoenix has the far better chance to get a package that the Brooklyn Nets would want. And at the same time, like you said, you can't necessarily just send him anywhere. And so it might take some creativity. It might take more teams, might take some extra work. But I think he wants to be in Phoenix. They have a lot to trade. I think ultimately, if you're asking me to pick one spot, I think that is the one that makes the most sense.
You agree?
Yeah, I say Phoenix. Historically, when a star player wants to go to a team, he ends up getting to that team. It's not 100%.
Right.
Kawhi Leonard is a classic case. He gets sent to Toronto in that situation. But I would bet on Durant having enough of a say here to force his way into Phoenix.
If I remember right, that worked out okay for Kawhi Leonard.
It did.
Pretty well. So let's turn our attention to Durant's, well, I guess they are still teammates in Brooklyn, at least for the time being. Kyrie Irving. He filed paperwork to pick up his $36.5 million option with the Nets for next season. That was just a couple of days ago. Earlier this week, there's a lot of drama surrounding Kyrie after he released a list of teams he would consider in a trade, and that list included the Miami Heat, the Philadelphia 76ers, the Los Angeles Lakers and Clippers, New York Knicks, and Dallas Mavericks. These are the teams he listed as he'd like Brooklyn to consider in a possible sign and trade. Kyrie is 30 years old. He'll be an unrestricted free agent in 2023. So we talked about Durant, 4 years left on his deal. Kyrie just has the one. So what kind of value are the Nets looking to get in a trade for him?
Well, the Nets are focused on making Durant trades. Kyrie right now is an ancillary piece. And it is possible if you get into a 3 or 4 team trade, which those are difficult, but they do happen, that Kyrie could move as a part of a larger trade, and that he would just be a facilitation piece and, c'est la vie, Now, what I think is more likely is that the Nets do a trade for Durant first, then evaluate what do we now have on our roster, what do we now have on our books, what do our desires turn into, and then they do a Kyrie trade. The complication with him, Dan, he makes $36 million. Trading any player who makes $36 million is a challenge. And it's really a challenge if you are already loaded on your books. Like what people are focused on, and certainly Kyrie is focused on, is the Lakers. Well, the Lakers, the piece that they have to trade for him is Russell Westbrook. Mm-hmm. Well, let me just tell you, Russell Westbrook makes $47 million. That's $11 million based on my math. And how about this one? When Kyrie, when Kyrie gets traded, he's owed a $5 million trade bonus. So that means that in a Westbrook for Irving trade, that's $16 million potentially to the books of the Brooklyn Nets. That's not an auto yes, even if they're getting draft compensation. So this one's going to be a little bit more complicated. I believe his market is going to be narrow, and I believe the price for him is going to be low. And and maybe the price gets low enough that some other teams jump in. We'll have to see.
To use a recent phrase that was in the topic of conversation, in this situation, Kevin Durant is the bus driver in terms of where this is going to go, and Kyrie Irving is the passenger in this situation, which for a lot of the past week he has not been. And one other thing to bring up really quick, I think to Brian's point, there isn't a huge market for Kyrie's services. We saw the Lakers were the only team willing to do a sign and trade because they were the only one desperate enough to take him on a long-term deal. I do think the market could be a little bit bigger on a one-year deal because there's no long-term risk, and therefore some teams might say it's worth throwing him a moderate asset to maybe take a flyer on him, and if it doesn't work, you have a big expiring contract anyway.
All right, so we asked you for a pick on Durant. What's your pick on where Kyrie Irving plays next season?
My pick is not the Lakers, just because I don't really know where he's going to go, but I think
Just not the Lakers?
Just not the Lakers.
You're taking the other 29 teams?
I'm taking
I
the
didn't know
field.
that was an
Does that
option.
include Brooklyn? I don't understand.
I decided to make my own rules.
I'm going to
process
pick
of
not
elimination?
the Nets. How about
All right.
that? How about that for a hot take?
That is the 100%.
I don't like it. I want a team. I don't want a not. Where's he going to play?
I got Lakers again because I think it's what he wants, and ultimately I'm not sure that the Nets are going to have much of a true option. Kyrie could negotiate down that trade bonus. Also, if worse comes to worse and they can't find a trade and they don't want to take on Russell Westbrook, they could just buy Kyrie Irving out. They could hit the free agent market and go sign with the Lakers. That's what really would be an interesting
Or they
scenario.
could also do what the Rockets did with John Wall last year and have him sit at home and get paid and maybe use him as an expiring contract later in the season. There are other options here.
true.
The Kyrie situation, unlike the Durant situation, could potentially drag out for a little while.
All right, well, here's what we'll do. We'll have you on every day, and you can tell us another team that he's not going to. And if it lasts 29 shows...
That'll get us to training camp, and then you can
we'll
take
see.
back over it.
All right, sounds good. Tune in next week to see where else Kyrie's not going. We did have news today. It was a trade in the NBA. The Pacers trading guard Malcolm Brogdon to the Boston Celtics. This is sources telling our Adrian Wojnarowski earlier this afternoon. Celtics are sending back Daniel Tice, Aaron Nesmith, Malik Fitz, Nick Stauskas, Juwan Morgan, and a 2023 first-round pick. That's what goes to Indiana in the trade for Brogdon. I assume that there are other ancillary, outcomes with regard to those guys.
Yes.
But you spent a lot of time, Tim, covering the Celtics
Yep.
this season. What do you make of this move?
This is a really big all-in move by the Boston Celtics. Now, it's not an all-in move from the sense that they gave up assets for him. They gave up their first-round pick in next year's draft, which frankly should be a pretty low first-round pick given how good they're probably going to be. And they gave up all 5 of those players that you named in there, Dan. None of those guys are among their top 8 players in their playoff rotation. So this is the Boston Celtics taking on a ton of money this year and in the future, but doing so to add a playmaking guard, the exact kind of guy that Brad Stevens and Ime Udoka talked about at the end of the season, the president of basketball operations, the coach of the Celtics. They needed to take this team to the next level because when you saw in the NBA Finals, when they went up against the Golden State Warriors, the Celtics lost that series on offense. Their defense held the Warriors down. Steph Curry was incredible in that series, deserving Finals MVP, was unbelievable. But they held the Warriors around 100 points a game in that series. Mm-hmm. Boston could not score in that series. And Brad Stevens said at his end-of-season press conference, this team needed to add playmaking and having more ball movement out there. Malcolm Brogdon averages 19 and 5. He's a 37% career three-point shooter. He is a huge pickup for this team as they try to finally get another championship.
When was the last time the Celtics paid the luxury tax?
I believe about a decade ago.
Okay, they're headed into the tax big time here with this move, Dan. They're headed towards around $30 million in tax, and they may not even be done doing their roster yet. So that's a huge investment by the ownership, who doesn't typically go this far, trying to get another piece that could lead them to that one more step to the championship. Now, terrific value in terms of this because they give a protected first-round pick essentially in the ancillary pieces. But I will say, Brogdon is owed about $68 million over the next 3 years. That is why the Pacers were willing to trade him for a low price, relatively. And he's had injury problems. He's averaged about 48 games over the last 3 seasons.
Last year he played 33, to your point.
I think 36, but whatever it was. He has foot issues, knee issues. So it is a tremendous talent add, but there does come some baggage with him, which is why they're able to do the deal.
And the one other thing that's interesting about this trade from a Celtics standpoint is in the past, when Danny Ainge was running the team, they would hoard their draft picks and wait to get a star, like when they got Kyrie Irving.
Yeah.
This is 3 straight trades now over the past calendar year to get Al Horford, Derek White, and Malcolm Brogdon, 3 good players, but like role players and kind of high-end talent role players that Brad Stevens has used first-round picks to get. And it's been a marked change in strategy, and it was a big reason why the Celtics got to the finals last year, and it's why they're hoping to get back there again.
Right. I mean, they're right there. You talk about taking them to the next level. That's literally 2 more wins,
That's
right?
right.
To get a championship. So do you make them the favorite coming out of the East again next year?
Well, I think the East is a little bit bunched together, and let's see where Kevin Durant ends up.
Great point.
Because if he shows up in Miami in the fall, we may have a different discussion.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as of right now, given the uncertainty in Brooklyn, and I mean, we said before we thought the most likely outcome is for Durant to go to Phoenix. This is a huge move for me. I thought the Bucks were the favorite in the East. Right now, if Malcolm Brogdon's healthy, I think the Celtics are right there. I mean, that's a really big-time move for them to be able to not only get a guy of Brogdon's caliber, but to not give up anybody credible off their roster from their rotation. I did not think they could make a move like that. Pretty big thing for them.
All right, Eastern Conference champs making moves to try and get them over that 2-win hump to a title. Speaking of the title, the team that won a title is keeping one of their own. This just in, according to Woj, Kevin Looney is going back to the Warriors. Kevon Looney, going back to the Warriors on a 3-year, $25.5 million deal. My apologies, Kevon. We will continue to update you on any and all news throughout the hour. But in the meantime, what do you got on the Kevon Looney trade?
So this is a pretty big
deal.
This is a pretty big move for the Warriors, Dan, coming off the championship to get Kevon Looney, their starting center back. He was jokingly called Moses Maloney by his teammates during the conference finals because of his unbelievable rebounding prowess, and he was a big part of why they were able to beat Boston and win that championship. But it's been interesting over the opening 24 hours of free agency to see how Golden State has kind of attacked this. They're already to get Kevon Looney back, but they were hoping to also get back one of Gary Payton Jr. or Otto Porter Jr., 2 key guys in their championship run. They were not able to sign either of those guys, though. Otto Porter goes to the Raptors. Gary Payton goes to the Blazers. It'll be interesting to see how Golden State replenishes some of that depth moving forward.
Lots going on around the NBA, of course, and we will have more as the show rolls along. The Kevin Durant trade request sent next year's title odds all over the place. Our wagering expert will tell you whether there's value in the market because of that.